Well, good morning on the West Coast, good afternoon here on the East Coast, and good evening to my friends in the UK and Europe. I'm Tom Strange, and I'm Chief Curator for the Sigal Music Museum, and I am really happy to bring a short program to you today regarding the double manual Kirkman harpsichord that was in the Sigal Music Museum collection. It was built in 1761 by Jacob Kirkman, and a tremendous piece of history. I'm going to step up and just let you guys see quickly this panorama that we have, because as it turned out, Marlowe had bought this particular instrument in 1987, and I knew of its existence. When the 1758 came up for sale in 2012, then I thought, well, I'd love to have one like Marlowe's. And so I was able to buy this one, and it's now part of the permanent collection here at the museum. And so we have an astounding cache of riches here. It's the only place where you can actually see two of these side by side in good playing condition and ready to demonstrate. The one that we're going to talk about today in particular is this one here that was built in 1761. And this particular instrument was the wedding present from King George III to his new bride, Charlotte. So Charlotte of Mecklenburg had come to be the new queen. It was a political move. George actually had another lady in mind, but they thought the better of it and said, no, you should make this alliance with Charlotte. And so they did. Between them, they had 15 children, 13 of which survived to adulthood. And as it turns out, we have an image of Charlotte just as she is at that age where she's coming to England and she's going to meet George. It's important to note that music in England during George II's time had been something that was sort of there, but not really celebrated in any real way. When Charlotte came, she created a real furor. She was a very good musician herself, particularly a keyboardist. She had her own Rutgers harpsichord, and on the extended trip from Germany to England, she played and sang her harpsichord on board the boat that was bringing her over, and everybody was talking about it. So that by the time she got to London, it was just all the furor. Thousands of people turned out to be the first to see Charlotte. Several people were trampled and lost their lives. It was just a tremendous outpouring. And music suddenly came alive because Charlotte loved music and all things musical. She brought Johann Christian Bach from Germany to London as her music master. He became what we call today the London Bach. Certainly very important in the commercial circles, the musical circles in London during his time. And so music went from something that was just sort of in the background to something that was really being promoted during that time. And we certainly see London popping up quickly as a major center for making instruments. In London, we had Burkitt Schutte and Jacob Kirkman both building harpsichords, both building large quantities of harpsichords. They were, in fact, the two biggest builders in the world at the time. And certainly there are more Kirkmans extant than any other maker at this point. There's still over 170 Kirkman harpsichords that we still know about. These two are sort of special because, as you notice, they're rather heavily decorated in this marquetry. But you can see in this case we have dark figures on a light background. As it turns out, the one that I bought from 1758 is light figures on a dark background. When these were made, they're actually panels that would have been pressed together, and so you're cutting through 2 layers of dark and 2 layers of light, meaning that anytime you make a pattern with light on dark, you've also made a pattern of dark on light. You might immediately think, well, maybe these two are carbon copies of each other, but not quite. This one has slight differences, but just notice all the work that was done. And if you can see this eagle here on the side, this eagle is made of 27 separate pieces of marquetry that have been cut out. They've been hand shaded in hot sand and then reassembled just to make this piece. So to produce one of these wonderful harpsichords would be something that would take probably well over a year of many specialists' time. We can back off just a little bit. And then you see that they're double manual harpsichords. So we're going to talk about what that means. If you want to know a little bit more about these kind of harpsichords, I would recommend this book. I helped write this one, but this was Jacob Kirkman, Harpsichords, Maker to Her Majesty. And this is something that Charles Mould and Peter Mould and I put together about 4 years ago. Good reference book. I was the one that had done the research on the various marquetry, having owned one of these. And so this is an action model for a double manual harpsichord, and I'd like to give a shout out to Colonial Williamsburg, who was so gracious as to let us have these action models for extended use. And so we're still making pretty good use of them here at the museum. The lower manual or the upper manual is here, and if I play the upper manual, I can actually access it remotely. And you see what's happening. I've got a jack here that's fairly short, and I've got the first of my 8-foot jacks here. And if I bring just this jack on here, this is called the lute stop or Nazard, the nasal stop. What it does is it's going to pluck the string very much closer to the nut right here. And by doing that, I get very, very little of the fundamental, and I get most of the harmonics in the string. And so it makes a kind of a distant nasal sort of sound, which is actually fairly pleasant. I can then move a stop over and bring in this 8-foot. Now I'm plucking deeper into the string. The fundamental suddenly comes back, and I can keep this lute stop on and then keep the harmonics and have the fundamental together, which makes a very rich sort of sound, and I'm going to demonstrate that in a moment. And then if I take the lute stop off by moving the knob and just it moves the jack over about 2.5 millimeters, by doing that, then I just get the single 8-foot string, which is a sweet, sort of purer sound. It has some harmonics on it, of course. That's what makes a harpsichord sound like a harpsichord. But it also has a great deal of the fundamental, the actual, if I'm playing an A, I actually see on an oscilloscope the A frequency pop up here. When I play this one, I see almost none of that A frequency. I see all the other frequencies on either side of it, and it's actually your brain that puts it all together and says, oh, that still sounds like an A to me. Well, what you're really doing is combining mentally all those harmonics that tells you, oh, yeah, that's an A. On the lower manual, I have a little bit of a different disposition. I can bring in one 8-foot, I can bring in 2 8-foots, and then in the back, I can bring in the 4-foot. So the 4-foot means the bridge that's half the distance between the nut and the 8-foot bridge. And so every string there is half the length, and so it will be 1 octave higher. So by doing this, I get this, every time I play a note, I actually play an octave higher with this jack in place. And it gives a very, very rich organ-like sound. What I cannot do is actually have this jack on while I'm doing that, or its damper will actually damp out the 8-foot. And so it won't work. You always have to take this off. You can, however, if you want to, put that on and play just this back 8-foot, and what that will do is create something like a buff stop. Now, I don't know that they ever used it. It's actually buffing too far into the string to be a real buff stop, which would normally be way back here, right next to where the string leaves the nut, so that you have at least the full length of string to try to vibrate. It still is going to be a very attenuated vibration, but the buff stop was very popular in French harpsichords. Curiously, not all that popular in English harpsichords, and I'm not sure whether part of the reason is that they had this lute stop concept in there, and they might have been doing that. The English harpsichords work very differently from the French. So with the English, we're always using these knobs on the front to move things. With the French harpsichords, we have a dogleg coupler, so we can push the keyboard in or pull the keyboard out and couple with some of these other jacks. When we get to that point, I'll show you how that works on a Tascan French harpsichord. But in this case, we're going to stick with the English. Hopefully now you have an idea of how all that is actually working inside the harpsichord. Let's pull over here. So the first I'm going to demonstrate is that lute stop, and I'm going to play that on the upper manual. And you can hear that has a nice distant, sort of far away sound to it. If I then bring in the 8-foot, and now listen to it with that off. Sweeter. So those are three distinctly different sounds that you can get just with moving the jacks in and out. Still, it's nothing but wood and wire. On the lower manual, I can play two 8-foot strings together. And then I can bring in that 4-foot simply by moving it over. And so you can hear that's a really big, rich sort of sound. And so there's the full English harpsichord, in pretty much all of its glory. And with a Kirkman, you actually have one of the largest English harpsichords that was made. And I think this particular one, now that we've done some work on it, certainly very fine sounding indeed. What did we have to do with this one? Well, it had a few problems. One of the problems was that because of the way these things are made, the soundboard wants to kind of creep forward a little bit, and the glue joint had failed, and so the front of the soundboard here had actually popped away from the belly rail, and then it was kind of free to keep moving, and so it split and leapt up and then was blocking all the 4-foot strings and almost getting into the 8-foot strings at that point. So nothing would play, and then it was also jamming against the jack. So right through here, there was no sound whatsoever. Nothing could be played. What we were able to do was make an access port below, and there is the thought that the bottoms of these harpsichords are simply something tacked on to keep the bugs and the rodents out. But it isn't really that simple. The bottoms of these harpsichords are actually somewhat integral to keeping them with very, very little cheek warp. And you'll notice this particular instrument has very little cheek warp. It was worked on by Broadwoods in 1911, and they added a block of wood here in the corner, which I agree with, I approve of, because they didn't do anything but just glue that block in. It hasn't erased any history. It does really help with that. But the other thing that you always want to make sure is that the bottom of these harpsichords is secure and continuous, so that because the strings are pulling like this, and the bottom actually keeps it from twisting too much. So we were able to bring the soundboard back down and into place, and then from below you're able to do all the repair work that you need to do. I've been using a carbon fiber cloth dipped in hide glue and then press that into place. It is immensely strong once it dries, but it's very, very lightweight. So it weighs as little or even less than the linen they would normally use, but it can never age. It can never do like linen, which is after a couple of hundred years, the linen fibers have begun to get truncated and shortened by ozone in the air and other reactives that are in the air. And finally, the linen gets fragile and it just splits. The carbon fiber can never do that. It is chemically inert. The nice part is that if in 100 years somebody says, that bonehead strange, what was he thinking about? A little warm water and it comes right off. I've done nothing. So I've left nothing behind. And I have a feeling that in 100 years they're not going to have to mess with this harpsichord. In any case, it's already lived 260 years and it's doing very well. The soundboard of this one, when Broadwoods did what they called a total refurbishment, they shellacked the soundboard. Now, typically in an instrument of this age, there's no shellac on it. Shellac was known. Shellac had been invented and discovered, back in the Egyptian times, but it wasn't heavily used, and it certainly wasn't used to, shellac over soundboards. And quite honestly, if it had been, they would have done a little bit neater job of it. I did not take the shellac off the soundboard because right now sonically it's not doing anything bad. It does kind of keep the dirt from getting into the wood and staining the soundboard over time. But inexplicably, they had also shellacked the inside key well for this harpsichord. And there was never any finish on the soundboard to begin with, so shellacking it, that shellac is stuck and it's in a good place and it's really not doing anything. But the inside of this key well had been given an oil and sandurac varnish, as it would have normally been, and the shellac had begun to bloom and pull away from that original varnish, so that as you looked at it, it looked kind of grayed out and very indistinct in places. There was a spot over here where you could barely see the marquetry. That stuff comes off with a little weak alcohol solution, and so with a little weak alcohol, you won't touch the original finish at all, but you can get all that shellac off. And as we did, things really pop back to life. The one place where we're always careful, we just kind of leave it alone, is here on the name board. I did a little bit of the flanking area. I've left the middle completely untouched. And you can see that there's still some of that graying out and fading here, which is really not fading. It's simply they shellacked over everything. And because that's India ink underneath there, I'm going to leave it alone. It's good and it's not getting in the way of anything. But the instrument, quite honestly, didn't show as well as it might. And we always want these things to show at least as close to what they were originally. And this was a non-original material that had been added to this key well. So I didn't feel particularly tough about taking that away. I left it on the soundboard. I didn't do anything to the case itself other than a damp cleaning. Yes?
Gilbert Ritchie asks, why would someone shellac a soundboard?
Well, you shellac a soundboard to keep the moisture from getting to it readily. As a soundboard picks up moisture, it's going to change dramatically, and so today almost all soundboards in your pianos and such are shellacked on the top. Curiously, some of them are shellacked on the bottom and some are not, and it doesn't make any sense because the bottom of the piano is completely open. It gives it a finished look. Marginally, it helps with dirt and dust and movement from humidity. Violins always sound best in the white, but if you give a white violin to a violinist, it's going to get really rubbed and dirty quick. So we learned 400 years ago to put on a coat of like a spirit varnish. You want something that won't soak into the wood. It wants to lay right on the wood. It needs to be thin, because we don't want to interfere with the vibration of the wood. Shellac is a good choice for that. And oil varnish is a terrible choice for a soundboard, and you would never want to put that on there. On the other hand, this is not a sonic element, and so an oil varnish in here made a lot of sense. The real question is, why in the world did they ever shellac it in the first place? Because clearly it still looks quite good as it was. All right, so that's told you a little bit about these two. What can we say about the two instruments themselves? First of all, as Deborah pulls back a little bit, one of the things that you might be tempted to think is that, they're identical. As it turns out, not so much. This instrument here is a 1/2 inch longer and about 3/8 of an inch wider than the 1758. And it wasn't like they just kind of grabbed wood and cut to whatever length they wanted to. So what it tells me is that Kirkman is subtly changing his design, because these things are all cut to a very exacting plan. They have to be. Everything has to fit very closely. And you have millimeter tolerances when you get down to the final thing coming together. So curiously enough, none of the parts of the 1761 actually will fit on the 1758. There is another interesting little note. This is what the key tops look like. You can see the ebonies and the ivories, and you see this extra line right here. This extra line is a little scribe line, and it's there as a kind of a decorative line. It also demarcates where the edge of the ivories have been smoothed over. They're rounded. This is unlike the way we do normal pianos today, where the rounding is very, very, very subtle. On a Japanese piano, they feel sharp. On these, they're really nicely rounded over. And so the scribe line is like a decorative element. And in this distance between the actual top of the key and then this tail is a separate piece of ivory on all of these instruments. This distance here is very demonstrative of the action maker. But notice that these are all pretty good. I've actually taken these from the bass end of the 1758 harpsichord, and if I can go over, so here is the treble end of this 1761, and notice how the scribe lines are getting worn through. This is an example of how we can see where the person was playing, and then as I come back, because you can't see them here in the camera, I'm just going to describe to you that on this instrument, the heaviest loss of scribe lines are actually right up in here. So effectively, the upper treble on the top of the keyboard, there is some loss, but it's not as much. So they weren't playing the top manual 3 times more heavily played here on the bottom. When we go over to the 1758, on the other hand, the wear pattern drops about a 1/2 an octave. So what can we say? Well, we know that this was Charlotte's harpsichord. It was known as Charlotte's harpsichord through all of the 20th century as it progressed. Charlotte died in 1818, and she died somewhat without much money. She had, her estate was valued at £147,000 or less. Almost all of it were jewels that she felt belonged to the crown, and they're part of the crown jewels today. She left those back to the estate of the court. And so her few effects were actually broken up and sold at auction in 1819, including the harpsichord, which in 1819 would have maybe fetched a few pounds, but not any more than that. Remember, by 1818, this thing is hopelessly outdated, and away it goes. I'm not sure that I told you, but I need to tell you that in 1765, when Mozart and his family came to London, Mozart played for the court almost certainly on this harpsichord. This was the premier harpsichord out in the middle of the room where the Mozarts came. it's impossible to believe that it wasn't actually this harpsichord that he played, and he came back 3 times. Because she was German and because George III's ancestors were German, they heavily promoted German musicians, and they were very fond of the Mozarts, and spoke very highly of them. As I say, had 3 separate concerts. And so there's a little line from Raiders of the Lost Ark where he says, we are simply passing through history. This is history. And I think with this particular harpsichord, we have to conclude that this truly is history. And it is a little chilling to sit there and play and know that Mozart himself has in a somewhat more advanced state than I can be, has played over this harpsichord. So, as to sound, guys, I will tell you that to the best of our ability, we restore these. We try to make them as much as what they were as possible. But quilling choices, 260 years of history has gone by, and I won't guarantee you that every last bit of it sounds exactly as it did, but we've tried to bring it as close as possible. And curiously enough, the 2 harpsichords have 2 very subtly different sounds. So if you'll listen, now let's play the same little thing over here. They're both lovely, but they're both different. On this one, when we restored this one, it needed to be restrung. It had been strung by Broadwoods in 1911. They had their own ideas of stringing. Remember, it's the revivalist period, so Chickering is making harpsichords in Boston at this time. Dolmetsch is already back in London. I have no doubt that he stirred somebody up that owned this and said, well, you ought to get Broadwood to do it over for you, and that's when it got done. Their stringing was kind of their own ideas, even though on the nut it's clearly marked what the diameter of the string should be. In any case, the wire was rubbish, and it had to come off to do the repairs anyway. So we put on the Stephen Burkett wire. And I will tell you guys that I am very, very positive about this wire, particularly the brass. Historically with brass wire, stretch and stretch and stretch, and then sometimes it becomes brittle all by itself and then breaks. This brass, one stretch and done. And as far as brittleness is concerned, I didn't have any problems throughout the stringing of this instrument. So I would very much recommend that if anybody's looking to restore the instruments, that Stephen Burkett wire be considered as a real strong possibility. We have Burkett wire on this one. I have Malcolm Rose wire on the other one. I've used Malcolm Rose for 20 plus years, and I don't think either one is a bad choice. I think that with a marginal edge, I'm giving it to Burkett wire now, because I think it has a little bit more sparkle to it. What it does, though, it gives us 2 harpsichords matched well enough that they could be in concert together. And so we're looking forward to being able to bring you some programs with these 2 harpsichords. Well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Remember that you can always catch these things a little bit later. I enjoyed bringing you some of this information. If you have questions, post them on Facebook, send me a messenger request. And then just to finish up, to say that, as you guys know, we're doing this because we're all socially distancing and the museum is not open. And if a museum is not open, then it's not making money. So if you would like, now is a good time to consider joining the Sigal Music Museum. I'm going to keep bringing you some of these treasures, and even after we reopen, I'm going to keep up with some of this because the response has been extremely good. But would love to have a donation, would love to have a membership, would love if you can help us in any particular way. So I'll sign off now and say thank you, and we will be back on Friday.